had always loved hiking. There was something about being alone in the woods, away from the noise and stress of daily life, that made me feel alive. But this trip was different. It wasn't supposed to be a challenge or a test of endurance. It was supposed to be a relaxing hike in the mountains near my cabin, a solo journey to clear my head. The day started off as a typical morning. I woke up early, around 5 a.m., and packed my gear. A small backpack with just the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map of the area, and my camera. I wasn't planning on doing anything too intense, just a peaceful walk through the woods, snapping some photos, and maybe finding a quiet spot to sit and think. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the air was cool and crisp as I stepped out of the cabin. The scent of pine trees filled my nostrils, and the sound of birds chirping echoed through the quiet forest. I smiled to myself, feeling the familiar peace of nature settle around me. The trail I was taking was well-marked and easy to follow. It ran along a stream for the first mile, then started to climb up the mountain toward an old lookout point. I had done this hike many times before, but each time it felt different. The landscape was always shifting with the seasons, and I loved seeing the subtle changes from year to year. The first part of the hike was smooth, with the gentle sound of running water beside me. I paused briefly to take a few photos of the mist rising off the stream and the way the light was filtering through the trees. Everything felt calm. Too calm, maybe, but I wasn't concerned. There was no reason to be. After a while, the stream began to narrow, and the terrain started to change. The path became steeper, the ground more uneven. I had to watch my step, making sure I didn't slip on the loose rocks. I pushed forward, determined to reach the lookout point before noon. As I climbed higher, the trees began to thin, and the forest gave way to a series of large, rocky outcrops. I could see the valley stretching out below me, the view getting better with every step. My breathing grew heavier, and I was starting to feel the strain of the climb, but I didn't mind. It was just part of the experience. Then, just as I was about to crest the final rise before the lookout, I heard something. It was a sound that didn't belong in the natural quiet of the woods. A faint rustling, almost like footsteps, but not quite. My heart rate quickened, but I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just a deer or some other animal moving through the underbrush. I reached the top and stopped, breathing in the view. It was breathtaking, as always. The valley spread out beneath me, with the small town in the distance barely visible through the trees. I felt a moment of satisfaction, having made it this far. But then the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. I scanned the area, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. The air was colder now, the light beginning to change as the sun rose higher. I turned around to take a photo of the lookout, and that's when I saw it. A figure. It was standing near the edge of the cliff, just outside the tree line. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but something about the way it stood, completely still and unmoving, felt wrong. My first instinct was to call out, to ask if they were okay or if they needed help, but the words stuck in my throat. I watched the figure for a moment longer, waiting for it to move. When it didn't, I took a step forward, trying to get a better look. That's when I noticed something else. The figure wasn't alone. There were other shapes, just barely visible in the shadows, standing behind it. A chill ran down my spine. My heart was beating in my chest now, too fast, too loud. I took another step forward, my legs trembling, but then the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it turned and started walking away from me, toward the trees. The others followed. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it a group of hikers? No. The way they moved, it was like they were gliding, not walking, and they didn't make a sound. I should have turned around then. I should have left, but for some reason I stayed. I don't know what I was hoping for. Maybe I wanted to be sure I hadn't imagined it. Or maybe I was just too scared to move. I waited, watching the figures disappear into the forest. Once they were gone, the silence felt suffocating. I glanced around nervously, my eyes scanning every corner of the area. I knew the trail back down would take me through the same forest they had vanished into, and the thought made my stomach churn. After what felt like an eternity, I turned and began to retrace my steps. The hike down felt different now. The peaceful woods that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt oppressive, as though something was watching me. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot made my heart skip a beat. The descent was longer than I remembered. The trail that had seemed so familiar now felt foreign and ominous. The shadows in the trees seemed darker, and the air was thick with the sense of something out of place. My breath was shallow, and I could feel the weight of my fear settling in. I passed the stream again, but the sound of the water wasn't as comforting as it had been earlier. The rustling in the trees grew louder, as though something was moving through the underbrush, just out of sight. I kept moving, faster now, my legs burning from the effort. I wanted to get back to the cabin. I wanted to be away from whatever was in those woods. It wasn't until I reached the last stretch of the trail, just before I would emerge into the clearing where my cabin was, that I felt a sudden relief. The woods were behind me, and I could see the familiar outline of the cabin in the distance. The tension in my chest began to loosen, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been followed. When I finally reached the cabin, I rushed inside and locked the door behind me. I stood there for a moment, my heart still pounding in my chest, listening to the silence. It felt like the forest had followed me home. But then, as I took a deep breath and let the quiet wash over me, I realized something. I was safe. Whatever I had seen on that mountain, whatever it was that had made my skin crawl, was gone. The woods were silent again. I was alone, but this time the loneliness felt different. It was comforting. The danger had passed, and now I could finally breathe. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in hours, the images of the figures fading from my mind. I woke up the next morning to a peaceful sunrise and a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in days. Maybe it had all been a trick of the mind, a product of exhaustion and fear. But no matter what, I wasn't going back to that trail. I wasn't sure what I had seen up there, but I didn't need to know. The mountains would always be there, but some paths I decided were better left unexplored. I had been planning this hike for weeks, hoping to finally push myself through the mountain trails that had always intimidated me. The thought of being out there alone, away from everything, felt both thrilling and a little terrifying. I'd hiked before, but this was different. This wasn't just a walk in the woods. This was a journey into the unknown, into a remote, rugged stretch of wilderness where few people ventured. The weather had been perfect when I set off, with clear skies and just a slight breeze. But as the day wore on, things started to feel off. The trail was relatively quiet. The usual sounds of birds chirping and rustling leaves were absent. There was no breeze, not even a whisper through the trees. The silence was deafening, and the longer I walked, the more aware I became of how isolated I was. The trail had begun to narrow, the trees surrounding me thick and dense, casting long shadows on the ground. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation starting to get to me, but there was something else I couldn't shake. I paused for a moment, catching my breath. The sun was lower now, and the temperature had dropped slightly. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, looking around. There was no sign of anyone else. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I glanced at my watch. It was nearly 5 p.m. The trail had been going uphill for a while, and I knew I should be nearing the summit soon. The trail ahead twisted around a large boulder, and as I approached it, I heard something. At first, I thought it was just a squirrel or some small animal moving in the underbrush, But then it came again. The noise sounded like footsteps, and they were close. Too close. My heart rate picked up, and I strained my ears, trying to hear anything else. But there was nothing. The forest was silent once more. I stood still for a moment, waiting, listening. When nothing else came, I decided to keep moving, though a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. As I rounded the corner, I stumbled across an old, dilapidated signpost, barely legible now. The paint was chipped, the wood splintering, but it still stood. There was a faint trail marker carved into it. Lost Trail, it read. That caught my attention. I checked the trail map before I left, and there was no trail by that name. A chill ran down my spine. I could feel my senses sharpening, everything around me now tingling with the awareness that something wasn't right. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe I was just too tired. But the thought that I had somehow wandered off course crept into my mind. I checked my phone, but I had no service. Typical for remote areas, but it still left me feeling uneasy. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I continued, though the strange feeling in my gut was growing stronger. The path seemed to stretch on forever, and no matter how far I walked, I didn't seem to be getting any closer to my destination. The shadows were growing longer, and the air felt thick with an unnatural stillness. It wasn't like the mountain air I was used to. It felt heavy, oppressive, and then there it was again, the sound of footsteps. But this time it wasn't just a faint rustle. The noise was more distinct, deliberate, as if someone or something was following me. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickened my pace, trying to convince myself that it was just an animal, or maybe someone else on the trail. But I knew better. This was no animal. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My heart raced as I pushed myself harder, the thud of my own boots pounding on the dirt masking the noise behind me. I dared not look over my shoulder. I didn't want to see what was there, but it felt like whatever was behind me was gaining ground, staying right on my heels. Every now and then, I'd glance back, but there was nothing, no one, just the endless stretch of trees and the narrowing trail ahead. Panic set in. My breath was shallow, my legs burning from the effort, but I didn't dare stop. The trail had started to twist, and in my hurry, I missed a step, tripping over a root. I fell hard, hitting the ground with a thud, pain shooting through my knees. I scrambled to get up, but my legs felt like jelly. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement, any clue as to what was going on. But everything was still, too still. I stood, shaking, and continued on, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. I had to find my way back to safety. I couldn't keep running blindly. But no matter how fast I moved, no matter how much I told myself to stay calm, the feeling of being watched, of being followed, didn't fade. If anything, it intensified. Hours seemed to pass as I stumbled through the forest. The sun was almost gone now, and the only light came from the faint glow of my headlamp. I hadn't seen another soul since I first heard those footsteps. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't let me rest, kept telling me that something wasn't right. I was lost, and I was not alone. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached a clearing. It was small, but it gave me a sense of relief. I could finally take a breath, sit down, and figure out what to do next. As I sat on a rock, trying to collect myself, I noticed something odd. At the edge of the clearing, there was a structure, an old cabin hidden from the trail by the thick underbrush. It wasn't marked on any map I had seen. I had no idea how it had escaped my notice until now. I stood slowly, approaching the cabin. The door was slightly ajar, as though inviting me in. The wood was weathered, but the structure seemed solid. It was strange, but I felt an odd compulsion to check it out. I wasn't sure if it was relief or curiosity, but something urged me to step inside. I opened the door, the hinges creaking. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty. I fumbled for my flashlight and shone it around. The furniture was covered in dust, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. It seemed abandoned, forgotten by time. But the strange feeling of unease didn't leave me. If anything, it intensified. There was a narrow staircase leading to the second floor, but I didn't dare go up. I wasn't sure why, but something told me not to. Instead, I sat in one of the chairs, my head in my hands, trying to calm myself. I hadn't heard those footsteps for a while, but I didn't feel alone. My senses were on high alert, every creak and groan of the cabin making me jump. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I lost track of time, but then I heard it, soft at first, like a whisper on the wind. Footsteps, and this time they were outside. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, and looked out the cabin window. There was no one there. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things at this point, but I decided to leave. I didn't care about finding my way back to the trail. I just wanted to get away from whatever was out there. I grabbed my pack, turned, and ran. Somehow, I found my way back to the main trail just as dawn broke. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the mountains. I had no idea what I had experienced, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I made my way back to the parking lot, where my car was waiting. When I finally reached it, I looked back at the mountain one last time. I never went back to that trail. It's been years now, and I still can't explain what happened. Maybe I was just lost. Maybe it was all in my head. But every time I hike now, I can't help but glance over my shoulder. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I can still hear those footsteps. The trail seemed harmless enough when I set out that morning. I'd been hiking for years, and though I knew the woods could hold some surprises, I never expected this trip to be different. I had planned a solo hike to clear my mind, nothing too intense, just a steady climb up a familiar mountain trail that I had taken a dozen times before. I started at dawn. The air was crisp and cool, a perfect autumn morning with a hint of chill on the breeze. The leaves were turning, their reds, oranges, and yellows lighting up the trees in every direction. The path ahead was marked well, and I knew I wouldn't have to think too much about where I was going. As I walked, I felt the familiar rhythm of my feet hitting the earth, the sound of birds calling from the canopy above. Hours passed without much incident. The deeper I went into the forest, the more I felt disconnected from everything. It was just me, the trees, and the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. But soon something shifted. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustling of animals in the underbrush, grew quieter. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. It wasn't uncommon for the forest to go quiet when the weather shifted, or when the animals went into hiding. But then it became unnerving. The silence grew thick, pressing in from all sides. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. A breeze rustled the branches above me, and the birds resumed their calls. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I kept walking, my pace quickening, the trail winding upward. I came to a fork in the path, one route leading to the summit, the other veering off to a smaller overlook. I had been on both paths before, but something tugged me toward the lesser-used trail. It was narrower, with overgrown brambles and thick trees pressing in on both sides. It felt more intimate, more secluded, and I wanted to experience that quiet solitude. As I continued, the forest grew denser. The air became heavy with moisture, and the ground beneath me turned soft, almost muddy. The trail was harder to follow now, the markers less frequent. But I pressed on, determined to reach the overlook. I hadn't seen another hiker all day, and the thought of having this place to myself, away from the world, was appealing. That was when I heard the noise. It was faint at first, like a snap of a twig underfoot. I paused, listening intently. Another snap, louder this time, and then a rustling in the brush. My heart skipped. I was alone on the trail. No one should be out here. I looked around, but the dense trees and foliage obscured my view. The path was quiet again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one on it. I kept moving, faster now, my footsteps louder in the silence. My mind raced, trying to explain what I'd heard. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, or some other small creature. But I couldn't help the unease crawling up my spine. I had been on this trail many times, and there had never been anything like this before. Suddenly, I reached the overlook. It was a small clearing in the trees with a view of the valley below. I paused for a moment, taking in the beauty of the scene. The valley stretched out beneath me, bathed in the soft light of the afternoon sun. For a moment, I felt at peace, but the feeling didn't last long. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was just the sway of the branches. But no, there, at the edge of the clearing, I saw a figure standing just inside the treeline. I froze. It was a man. At least I thought it was. He was tall, wearing dark clothes that blended in with the shadows of the trees. His posture was rigid, unnatural, and his face was too still. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of his outline against the trees. My stomach turned. I didn't know what to do. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unsure whether I should move or wait. My mind raced. Maybe it was just another hiker, someone who had gotten off track. But there was something about the way he stood there, motionless, that made my blood run cold. I took a step back, hoping to move quietly, but the snap of a twig underfoot betrayed me. The figure turned, slowly, his head jerking toward me in a way that felt wrong. I quickly turned and bolted down the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick now, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic. I didn't dare look back as I ran, the path now a blur of trees and rocks. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself harder, faster. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees crowding the trail, the shadows deepening with each step. I could feel the presence behind me, like something was watching, following, waiting. The trail twisted and turned, and I stumbled more than once, my legs growing tired, my mind screaming at me to keep going. Couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, had to get out of this place. Finally, after what felt like hours of running, I reached a familiar stretch of trail. The trees thinned, and I could see the distant outline of the main trail where I had started my hike. I pushed myself harder, reaching the clearing just as the sun dipped below the horizon. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. When I finally got in, I locked the doors and sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My mind was racing, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't know what had happened back there, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. It was supposed to be a regular hiking trip, just a simple trail up the mountain near where I lived. I'd done this trail dozens of times before, but something about today felt different. Maybe it was the silence in the woods, or the way the clouds hung low in the sky, but I felt a gnawing unease the moment I stepped onto the trail. But I brushed it off. I always felt a little nervous before hiking, especially when I was by myself, but I had done it plenty of times, so why should this be any different? The air was cool, crisp, and smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. My boots crunched against the gravel path as I began my climb. The woods around me were thick, the trees tall and old. They blocked out most of the sunlight, creating a shadowy, almost secretive atmosphere that made the whole place feel isolated. There were no other hikers around, which was unusual for a popular trail like this one. I thought it was probably just early in the day, and most people hadn't started yet. As I walked, I kept my focus on the trail ahead of me. My feet moved automatically as I passed under branches that arched overhead like protective hands, and I admired the way the forest seemed to envelop me in its quiet. I've always liked hiking alone. It gave me time to think, to clear my mind. But this time, as I continued upward, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I would glance over my shoulder, but there was never anyone there, just the trees. The sound of my boots on the trail echoed loudly in the otherwise silent forest, and I felt an odd chill run through me. The path twisted and turned, the incline growing steeper as I moved deeper into the forest. There were no markers or signs, just a narrow trail that cut through the thick underbrush. I knew the way well, though, or so I thought. I had hiked this mountain countless times, but today, the trail seemed unfamiliar in a way I couldn't quite explain. The trees seemed taller, the air heavier, and the sounds around me different. At one point, I had to stop to catch my breath. I leaned against a moss-covered rock, wiping sweat from my forehead. My water bottle was nearly empty, and I cursed myself for not bringing more. As I looked up, something in the distance caught my eye, a faint trail of smoke curling up through the trees. My first thought was that someone else must be up ahead, maybe camping or cooking. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail, but it was still early, so it made sense that they'd be farther along. Curiosity sparked, I decided to investigate. The smoke seemed to be coming from just beyond a dense thicket of trees. I pushed my way through, brushing aside branches and leaves until I emerged into a small clearing. My eyes immediately went to a campfire, but there was no one around. I stood there, staring at the flames, the crackling sound filling the silence. It didn't make sense. There was no one here to tend the fire. The fire was small, yet steady, not like something that had been abandoned for long. I approached cautiously, unsure of what to think. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. I knelt beside the fire and poked the embers with a stick. The fire felt recent, almost as if it had just been left unattended. Quickly stood up, my heart racing. I looked around the clearing. There were no signs of a campsite, no tents, no backpacks, no evidence that anyone had been here. Just the fire. It was strange, unnerving. I should have turned around and gone back the way I came, but for some reason I didn't. I started walking again, but now every sound seemed amplified. The rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the snapping of twigs underfoot. It all felt too loud, too close, like the forest itself was alive and paying attention to me. The trail curved around a large boulder, and I noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, leading off the trail into the brush. They were large, deep imprints, as if someone heavy had walked through recently. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that they weren't mine. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the prints, wondering who else might be out here. But the thought that maybe someone had been watching me crossed my mind again, and I couldn't shake it. I walked faster now, trying to put distance between myself and the strange footprints. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be going on. Had someone else been on the trail? Why hadn't I seen them? Where were they now? As I continued uphill, the trees seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, and I struggled to shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone there, but there was nothing. Just the same empty trees, the same winding path. By now, the sun had started to dip behind the clouds, casting the forest in an eerie twilight. The temperature had dropped significantly, and I realized I hadn't brought a jacket or anything to keep warm. My legs were tired from the steep climb, but I couldn't shake the need to keep moving. It wasn't until I rounded a corner that I finally saw something that made me stop in my tracks. At the edge of the trail, partially hidden behind a thick cluster of ferns, was a small, weathered backpack. My heart skipped a beat as I approached it cautiously. The straps were torn, and it looked like it had been sitting there for a while, forgotten. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether I should touch it, but curiosity got the better of me again. I unzipped the backpack and peered inside. There was no food, no water, just a worn-out map, a flashlight, and a torn jacket. Nothing that would explain who it belonged to or why it was abandoned. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had a sickening feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I slung the backpack over my shoulder, intending to bring it back to the trailhead. But as I did, I heard something, just a faint rustle, as if someone or something was moving in the brush nearby. My heart raced and I quickly turned around. Nothing, just trees and the thickening shadows of the forest. I decided it was time to leave. I didn't care about finishing the hike or reaching the summit anymore. I just needed to get out of there. I retraced my steps, walking as quickly as I dared, but the woods seemed even darker, more claustrophobic. The trail, which had once seemed so familiar, now felt like an endless maze. I couldn't remember which direction I had come from. Everything looked the same. I stumbled forward, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my legs burning with exhaustion. I was lost. It wasn't until I saw the faint flicker of light through the trees that I felt a wave of relief. The trailhead. I had found it. The sight of the parking lot, the safety of other people, was enough to make me run. My pace quickened, and I didn't stop until I reached my car. The forest behind me seemed so far away, but the unease lingered in my chest. I got in the car, locked the doors, and took a moment to catch my breath. I looked back at the trailhead one last time. The woods were still quiet, like nothing had ever happened. I started the engine, my hands trembling slightly as I pulled out of the lot and drove away. As I drove down the winding road away from the mountain, I glanced at the backpack sitting beside me. I had no idea who it belonged to or if they were okay, but I was just happy to be away from that trail. The thought that someone or something might still be out there watching me made my skin crawl. The next morning, I went to the local ranger station to report the backpack I had found, but when I mentioned it, they looked at me like I was crazy. They told me that no one had been reported missing in that area. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I had missed, something I didn't fully understand. But whatever it was, I was never going back to that mountain again. The forest had shown me its secrets, and I was done exploring. I was always the type to enjoy solitude, the kind of person who found peace in the quiet of nature, away from the noise of the city. That's why, one crisp autumn morning, I decided to venture into the woods for a solo hike. It wasn't anything particularly special, just a trail I had discovered online that promised beautiful views and some challenging terrain. I was used to hiking, so I didn't think much of it. I packed a small bag with essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a map of the trail. I figured I'd be back by nightfall, as long as I paced myself. The hike started off easy enough. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft, golden light across the path. The air smelled fresh, with a mix of pine and damp earth. I could hear the birds chirping, their songs creating a pleasant soundtrack to my footsteps. The trail was well marked, leading me through a dense forest of tall trees. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the occasional crunch underfoot broke the otherwise serene silence. It was exactly the kind of hike I'd been craving: peaceful, quiet, and undisturbed. As I walked, I kept my eyes open for any wildlife. There were squirrels darting through the trees and the occasional deer in the distance, but nothing too out of the ordinary. I had hiked in forests like this before, so nothing felt unusual at first. The further I went, the less I could hear from the world outside the woods. The sounds of traffic, the hum of civilization, all faded into the background, leaving only the soft rustling of the leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. A few hours in, I reached a small clearing. The trail split in two directions here. One path led uphill, the other downhill. I had done my research before coming, and according to the map, the uphill path would lead to a lookout point where I could rest and take in the view. I decided to take the uphill route, hoping the higher vantage point would offer some stunning views of the valley below. The climb was steeper than I had anticipated. The trail was narrow, the ground uneven, and there were more rocks and roots than I was used to. It made the hike more challenging, but I didn't mind. I was used to a good workout. As I climbed higher, I noticed the air becoming cooler. The trees grew thicker, and the sunlight barely reached the ground anymore. It felt almost like I was entering a different world, one where time moved slower and everything felt heavier. I finally reached the top. The view was just as I had hoped, breathtaking. From the lookout point, I could see miles of forest stretching out before me, with the occasional hint of a river winding through the landscape. The mountains in the distance were covered in a haze, and I could see the tops of trees swaying in the breeze. I took a deep breath, savoring the moment. The beauty of nature always had a way of calming my mind. I sat down on a large rock at the edge of the lookout, pulled out my water bottle, and took a drink. Everything felt perfect. The peace, the solitude, it was everything I had hoped for. I checked my watch. It was still early afternoon, plenty of time to head back down the trail before it got dark. I decided to take a break and enjoy the view a little longer before starting the descent. But as I sat there, something began to feel off. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint exactly, but there was a slight change in the air, a subtle shift that made my skin prickle. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I shook the thought off, telling myself it was just the quiet of the woods playing tricks on me. I'd been hiking in forests like this before, and I had never felt like this. Still, I couldn't ignore the sensation. The breeze had stopped, and the forest had grown eerily silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. I stood up, brushing off the feeling, and decided to start heading back down the trail. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. There was a set of footprints in the dirt near the edge of the trail. They weren't mine. I stopped, my heart rate picking up. They were fresh, just barely visible in the soft earth, like someone had walked through only minutes before. I glanced around, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. It wasn't impossible for someone else to be hiking in the area, but the thought of someone else being up here with me, so far from the main trail, made my stomach twist. I quickly brushed it off and began my descent. The path was steep, and the loose rocks made my footing uncertain. But as I descended further, the unsettling feeling grew stronger. The woods felt different now. The silence was deafening, and every snap of a twig beneath my boots sounded far too loud. I glanced over my shoulder every now and then, half expecting to see someone behind me. But each time there was nothing. The further down I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees felt taller, denser, like they were crowding in. The path had become narrower, and I had to step carefully to avoid tripping over exposed roots. It was almost like the trail itself was becoming more difficult on purpose, as if it didn't want me to leave. I tried to focus on the trail in front of me, but my thoughts kept drifting back to those footprints. Were they really just a coincidence? Could someone else have been up here, or was something else at play? The air had grown cold, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself. My pace quickened. The sooner I was off this trail, the better. By the time I reached the bottom of the hill, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky. I wasn't far from the clearing where the trail split earlier, but I had this overwhelming sense of urgency now. I needed to get out. I needed to be off this trail and back to my car, away from whatever strange feeling had taken over the woods. I was close to the split when I heard it. A snap, a twig breaking in the distance. I froze. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. The trail behind me was empty, nothing but the trees and the fading light. The snap had been far enough away that it could have been an animal, maybe a deer or a squirrel, but the sound had been too clear, too deliberate. I forced myself to keep moving. The split in the trail was only a few hundred yards ahead. If I could just reach it, I'd be able to take the downhill path back to the main trail and out of the woods. I glanced behind me again, but there was still nothing. When I reached the split, I took the downhill path as quickly as I could, barely pausing to catch my breath. The further I went, the more frantic my steps became. I had to get out of here. It felt like something was following me, even though I couldn't see it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the familiar part of the trail that led back to the parking lot. The trail widened, and the trees began to thin out. I could see the parking lot in the distance, the familiar shape of my car waiting for me. I pushed myself harder, adrenaline coursing through me, until I was almost jogging the last stretch. When I finally reached my car, I slammed the door shut and locked it, breathing heavily. I looked out through the windshield at the forest behind me, but I saw nothing unusual. No one, just trees and shadows. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong with that hike. Something beyond just the isolation and the quiet. The footprints, the sudden silence, the strange sense of being watched. It all added up to something I couldn't explain. But one thing was clear: I would never take that trail again. I drove away from the forest, my mind still racing. The hike had started off as just another day in nature, but now it felt like something far more sinister had been lurking in those woods. I didn't know what had happened out there, but I knew I had been lucky to get out when I did. And for the first time in a long time, I couldn't wait to be home, far away from the woods and whatever was hidden in the shadows. It was one of those days when the air is crisp and the sky is cloudless. A perfect day for hiking. I had planned the hike for weeks. The trail was supposed to be one of the quieter, less traveled ones in the region, and I liked the idea of being alone in nature, away from the noise of the world. I arrived at the trailhead in the early morning. The sun was just starting to warm the earth, casting long shadows over the forest floor. I checked my gear one last time: water, snacks, my map, compass, and a first aid kit. It was a 12-mile loop, nothing too extreme, but the weather could change quickly in the mountains, so I made sure I was prepared for anything. The trail started off easy, winding through tall pines and dense underbrush. The scent of damp earth and pine needles filled the air, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the calls of distant birds. I felt a sense of peace as I moved forward, the rhythm of my steps in sync with the beating of my heart. About an hour into the hike, I reached a fork in the trail. The map showed that both paths eventually met up again, but the one to the left seemed to be the less traveled. I paused for a moment, trying to decide which route to take. I had already done some research and knew that the trail on the left was less maintained, but it seemed more interesting, more secluded. I liked the idea of being out of sight, far from the usual tourist crowd. I took the left path. The trees became denser, and the trail, though still marked, was less distinct. I had to pay closer attention to the ground to avoid stepping on rocks or roots that jutted out from the earth. The silence grew heavier here. There were no more bird calls, no distant sounds of human activity. It felt like I was the only person in the world. As the trail wound deeper into the forest, the sun began to be filtered through the thick canopy of branches. The temperature dropped slightly, and the shadows grew longer. I checked my watch. It was just past noon, but it felt later, like time had slowed down. Then, after another hour of hiking, I came across something odd. The trail ended abruptly in a small clearing. The ground was covered in thick moss, and the trees seemed to be growing in an unnatural circle, as if they'd been placed there deliberately. In the center of the clearing stood a large rock, jagged and weathered by time. It was out of place, as if it didn't belong there. But what really caught my eye was the faint outline of what looked like a path beyond the rock. I knelt down and touched the moss, which was thick and spongy. It looked undisturbed, like no one had been here in years. But I wasn't sure how long the trail had been abandoned. Maybe it was just a forgotten route that was no longer maintained. The thought made me hesitate for a moment, but my curiosity got the best of me. I decided to push forward. The new trail was even harder to follow. At first, it was just a faint line through the underbrush, barely visible among the ferns and tall grasses. But I pressed on, determined to see where it would lead. The trees were closer now, their trunks dark and thick, and the air seemed cooler, almost damp. The further I went, the more the landscape changed. The path dipped down into a ravine, and I had to carefully climb down some steep rocks. It was harder to find solid footing, and I slipped a couple of times, scraping my palms against the rough stone. Each time I caught myself before falling too far, but the risk made my heart race. I was alone out here, and any injury could quickly become serious. Eventually, the ravine opened up into another clearing, but this one was different from the first. There were no moss-covered stones or perfect circles of trees. Instead, the ground was barren, dry, and cracked. The air smelled stale, and the only sounds were the distant rustling of wind through the trees. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a faint trail of broken twigs leading off to the right. It wasn't much, but it was enough to catch my attention. I decided to follow it, though I was starting to feel uneasy. The quiet had grown deeper here, almost oppressive. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I followed the trail for what felt like an hour, each step growing more uncertain. The sun was now almost completely obscured by the dense canopy above. I had no idea how far I'd gone, and there was no sign of the main trail. I stopped for a moment, pulling out my map and compass. The needle of the compass spun wildly, and I could barely make sense of the map. My stomach churned with a sudden, irrational sense of dread. I had no idea where I was anymore. I decided to head back the way I came, but the trail I had followed seemed to vanish into thin air. The trees looked unfamiliar, and the landscape had changed. It was like the forest was shifting, moving in subtle ways that I couldn't quite understand. I tried retracing my steps, but nothing seemed right. Every turn, every rock, every tree looked the same. It was disorienting. Panic began to set in. I had been lost in the woods before, but never like this. The reality of my situation hit me. I had no idea how to get back to the main trail, and the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. I had to find shelter, and fast. I scanned the area for any sign of a path or shelter, but the forest was eerily silent. I could feel the weight of the growing darkness, the cold creeping in as the temperature dropped. I found a small overhang, a natural shelter formed by a large rock and some tree roots. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for the night. I gathered some branches and leaves to make a small fire. My lighter flickered weakly, but after several attempts, it finally caught. The flames felt like a small victory in the vastness of the wilderness. I sat by the fire, my body tense, trying to stay alert to any sounds in the dark. The hours passed slowly. I barely slept, waking every few minutes to check the fire, to listen for any sounds of movement. I kept telling myself that I would find my way out in the morning, that I just needed to wait until the light returned. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my small camp and set out again. This time I was more cautious. I didn't want to make the same mistakes. I knew that panic had been clouding my judgment yesterday, and I couldn't afford to let it control me now. I followed the terrain carefully, moving more slowly, marking my progress with scratches on trees and stones to make sure I didn't retrace my steps unnecessarily. After several hours, I finally came across a small stream. It wasn't on my map, but it felt like a sign of something familiar. I followed it upstream, hoping it would lead me back to a trail or a road. The stream wound through the forest, and as I followed it, I saw signs of human presence. Footprints, discarded wrappers, and finally, a worn trail marker. I felt a surge of relief. The trail was near, and I wasn't completely lost anymore. When I finally emerged from the forest, I was exhausted, my clothes torn, and my body aching from the strain of the past 24 hours. The first sight of the parking lot and the trailhead felt like a miracle. I had made it out. I sat down on the dirt, my breath shallow, trying to process what had happened. I had been lost in the wilderness, but now I was safe. It was a humbling experience. Nature had its way of reminding you just how small and insignificant you could feel when you were alone out there. But I had made it, and that was all that mattered. I would never forget that feeling of being lost in the woods. It was a reminder that the wilderness, no matter how beautiful, could also be unforgiving. But it also showed me the value of preparation, of staying calm, and of not giving in to fear. I looked back one last time at the trees, now bathed in the soft light of the morning. They stood silent and still, as if they had never moved at all. And for a moment, I thought I heard something, just the faintest sound of footsteps in the distance, but I couldn't be sure. It was probably just the wind. Either way, I wasn't going back there. I've always loved camping. Growing up in Vermont, I spent almost every summer in the woods with my family, and later, my friends. Nature was a place where I could unwind, disconnect, and find peace. That was the plan for the weekend. A solo trip, a little off the beaten path. I had heard about a secluded spot in the forest, far from any trailhead, deep enough that you could enjoy the quiet. It seemed like the perfect place to spend some time alone with my thoughts. I packed my gear early in the morning, loaded up my backpack with the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, and a good book, and drove a couple of hours to the edge of the forest. I parked at the last spot where cars could go, grabbed my pack, and set off on foot. It was a sunny, clear day with only the faintest hint of a breeze. Birds chirped, and the path was soft under my boots. I felt excited and free. The trail was marked, but as I moved deeper into the woods, I noticed the markers growing more sparse. I'd read online that this part of the forest had fewer visitors, but I didn't realize just how isolated it was. The farther I went, the quieter it became. The rustling of the leaves and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my feet were the only sounds. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost too quiet, but I didn't think much of it. I was used to hiking in remote places. I reached the spot by late afternoon. It was perfect, open enough for a campfire but surrounded by trees, with a clear view of the sky. I set up camp, made sure everything was in place, and started a fire. The crackling of the flames was comforting, and I enjoyed the solitude as the light began to fade. The shadows grew longer, and the air turned cool. As night settled in, I sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth and the crackling wood. The moon hung high above, casting a pale light over the forest. Everything felt still, too still. I tried to shake the thought from my mind. It was probably just the silence of being so far from civilization. The quietness in these deep woods could make anyone feel a little off. I was finishing my dinner when I first heard it. A faint noise in the distance, something like the sound of twigs snapping. I paused, listening. At first, I thought it might just be an animal, but the sound didn't come again. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably a deer or something harmless. But then there was a second sound, closer this time. It was faint, but I was sure I heard it. The sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate. I stood up, my heart rate picking up. It was strange. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail earlier, and there was no other campsite nearby. The woods around me were empty, at least they were supposed to be. I grabbed the flashlight, scanning the dark edge of the trees. Nothing, only the shadows of the branches moving gently in the wind. I told myself it was nothing to worry about, just the sounds of the forest settling for the night. But the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I decided to sit back down by the fire, forcing myself to relax. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The night stretched on, and I tried to push the eerie feeling away by focusing on the warmth of the fire. But no matter how hard I tried, I kept thinking I heard something moving just out of my sight. Twigs cracking, a faint rustling. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. The wind picked up, and the fire flickered, sending dancing shadows across the trees. It was as if the forest had come alive, and I was just a small part of it out of place. I felt my pulse quicken as another sound broke the silence. This one was louder, more distinct, a low, guttural sound like someone clearing their throat. It came from the direction of the trees, just beyond the reach of my firelight. I stood up, my flashlight trembling in my hands. I aimed the beam toward the noise, my breath shallow. Nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. I knew something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but my instincts were screaming at me to leave, to pack up and head back to the car. But I was far from the trail now, and turning back would mean hiking in the dark. The thought of leaving my tent and gear behind was unappealing. I could handle this. I would wait it out. I sat down again, trying to steady my nerves, but the unease wouldn't leave me. Every rustling leaf, every crack of a twig made my heart race. I looked around, my eyes darting between the dark trees. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. Then it came again. That sound, closer now, unmistakable. It was footsteps, slow and measured, as if someone was circling my camp. I didn't want to believe it, but there was no denying it. Someone was out there. I grabbed my knife, the only weapon I had, and stood up. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I shout? Should I call out? But the last thing I wanted was to make myself a target. I scanned the trees again, the flashlight beam bouncing around wildly. Nothing, just shadows. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just outside the light. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time seemed to slow as I stood frozen, listening to every crackle of the fire, every movement in the trees. And then, finally, the footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my body tense, my ears straining for any sound. But there was only silence. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually, I lowered the flashlight and slowly started to pack up. There was no way I could stay out here any longer. My instincts told me to leave, and I wasn't going to ignore them. I moved quickly, trying to stay as quiet as possible. As I packed my things, I could feel the presence behind me, like eyes watching from the darkness. But I couldn't risk looking back. I stuffed everything into my backpack and hoisted it over my shoulders. Without a second thought, I turned and started walking down the trail, away from the campfire, away from whatever had been lurking in the woods. The hike back felt endless. The darkness seemed to close in around me, and every crack of a branch underfoot sounded like it was coming from behind me. I quickened my pace, not daring to stop. After what felt like hours, I finally made it back to the car. I didn't look back once as I drove away from the forest. As the lights of the city grew closer, the tension in my body began to ease, but the unease stayed with me. I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was someone else out there, another hiker, a camper, who knows. But whatever it was, I haven't returned to that spot since. The woods can be a peaceful place, but there are moments when you realize just how alone you really are. And in that silence, you never quite know what's watching from the darkness. I had always been drawn to the mountains. Something about the sheer quietness of nature, the towering trees, and the rustling wind made me feel alive. This time, though, the mountains felt different. It wasn't the kind of peaceful, serene hike I was used to. No, this time, the air felt heavier, like it was holding something back. It was almost as if the forest itself was watching me, waiting for something. But I had no choice. I needed to clear my head, and hiking had always been my way of doing that. I parked my car at the base of the trailhead, the early morning sun just starting to push through the clouds. The parking lot was empty, which wasn't unusual for this part of the mountain. Most people preferred the easier, well-marked paths, but I liked the challenge of the less traveled routes. The one I was planning to take today wasn't on any maps, at least not any that I had found. It was an old path, overgrown with thick vegetation, but it was perfect for what I needed: solitude. I strapped on my backpack, checked my water, and adjusted my boots before stepping onto the trail. The first few minutes were nothing unusual. The sounds of birds chirping and the crunch of my boots on the dry earth were comforting, like they always were. I took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh pine scent, letting it fill my lungs. There was a slight chill in the air, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just enough to keep the sweat at bay as I made my way deeper into the woods. The trail quickly began to steepen, and I found myself climbing higher than I had anticipated. The trees around me grew denser, their trunks thick and twisted, their branches reaching up like skeletal hands. The air felt cooler the higher I went, but there was still something unsettling about the place. The deeper I went into the forest, the more I noticed how quiet it had become. There were no longer the sounds of birds or the occasional rustle of small animals. It was as if the forest had gone silent. I pressed on, my legs burning with the effort, but I pushed through. I had to get to the top. The thought of turning back now felt pointless, but something in my gut kept gnawing at me, urging me to be careful. Still, I ignored it, chalking it up to just the normal paranoia that came with being alone in the wilderness. As the sun began to climb higher in the sky, I reached a small clearing. I stopped for a break, taking a sip of water and wiping the sweat from my forehead. I looked around, trying to catch my breath. The trees here were spaced farther apart, and the ground was rocky and uneven. I could see the mountain peak in the distance, just barely visible through the thinning trees. It was an exhilarating sight, but it also felt distant, unreachable in a way. I sat down for a few minutes, enjoying the stillness. But then I noticed something strange. There was a faint sound, almost like a footstep, coming from deeper in the woods. I froze. My heart began to race as I listened more closely. There it was again, another footstep, and then another. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but they were definitely there. I felt my pulse quicken. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I scanned the trees, but I couldn't see anything moving. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer or a bear. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I decided to keep moving, hoping that the sound was just my imagination. But as I continued up the trail, the footsteps continued to echo behind me. They were getting closer, but when I stopped to listen, they would stop too. My thoughts raced. Could someone else be out here? It didn't make sense. The trail was barely used, and no one had passed me on the way up. I quickened my pace, trying to push the feeling out of my mind. But the footsteps were relentless, always just a few paces behind. My breath became shallow, and I found myself looking over my shoulder every few seconds, but there was never anyone there. The forest around me had taken on a darker tone, the trees crowding in closer, blocking out more of the sunlight. I felt claustrophobic, like the world was closing in. And then, out of nowhere, the sound of a twig snapping underfoot broke the silence. My heart nearly stopped. I whipped around, my eyes scanning the shadows, but there was nothing. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to convince myself it was just another animal or perhaps a loose branch falling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The footsteps continued, steady and deliberate. I started walking faster, almost running at times, but they were always there, keeping pace with me. It wasn't just the sound anymore. I could feel the presence, like someone was breathing down my neck, their eyes locked on me. I had to get out of there. The trail ahead of me narrowed, and the forest grew denser, the trees pressing in from both sides. I could barely see the sky anymore. Panic crept in. My chest tightened, and I felt like I was being suffocated. There was no escape. I tried to force my legs to move faster, but they felt heavy, as if the very earth beneath me was trying to hold me down. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. I paused, my body trembling with fear, waiting for the next sound. But nothing came. The silence was deafening. My brain screamed at me to turn around, to run back down the mountain, but I couldn't. I couldn't even bring myself to move. The air was thick, like something was waiting in the shadows. I had the distinct feeling that if I looked behind me now, I would see something I wasn't ready to understand. But then, just as quickly as the fear had come over me, it vanished. The air cleared, the oppressive weight lifted. I felt a surge of relief, though I couldn't explain why. It was as if the presence had finally moved away. Slowly, carefully, I turned around, scanning the empty trail behind me. Nothing. The forest was as still as ever. I wasn't sure if I should feel relieved or terrified. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of what had happened. The logical part of me told me that I had been imagining things. The footsteps had to be from an animal. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I had felt it too strongly. I decided to keep moving, but this time, my pace was slower, more cautious. I wasn't sure if I was afraid of what had been behind me or if I was just afraid of being alone in this eerie part of the forest. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jump. The anxiety was almost unbearable, but I couldn't stop now. The trail eventually began to flatten out, and the trees began to thin once more. The quietness of the forest persisted, but the ominous feeling had faded. I could see the summit now, just ahead. It was within reach, and I knew I had to get there. I couldn't let fear control me. With every step, the world seemed to open up more, the trees becoming less dense and the sky clearer. The view from the top was everything I had hoped for, the vast expanse of mountains stretching out as far as the eye could see. I sat down on a large rock, breathing in the fresh mountain air, feeling the tension leave my body. But as I looked out over the valley, something caught my eye in the distance. A flash of movement too fast to be a person, too fast to be an animal. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself I was imagining it, but a part of me wasn't so sure. I stayed at the summit for a while longer, watching the sun begin its descent, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. Eventually, I gathered my things and began the descent, still uneasy, but with the calming knowledge that I had made it to the top. I could finally head home. The hike down was uneventful, the trail winding through the trees as the day grew darker. By the time I reached the base of the mountain, the air had turned cool, and the forest had settled into its nighttime routine. The parking lot was empty when I returned, and the stillness of the evening wrapped around me like a blanket. I felt a sense of peace, even though the events of the hike still lingered in my mind. I started the car and drove off, the mountain slowly disappearing behind me in the rearview mirror. It wasn't until I was almost home that I finally allowed myself to breathe a little easier. The strange feeling had dissipated. Whatever had been following me was gone, or so I thought. The next morning, as I was unpacking my gear, I found something that shouldn't have been there: mud on the bottom of my boots. And it wasn't from the trail I had hiked. I don't know who or what was out there that day, but I know I'll never hike that trail again.